I'm not.
Thank you very much for coming to this first, hopefully as many, international lecture delivered from this wonderful facility. We are hopefully, well, I know we are definitely beaming to YouTube. This whole lecture will be live on YouTube, and hopefully, fingers crossed, some guys across in Boston Latin School in America will be also participating and asking questions. Just to explain the format a little bit, Dr. Julian Hazeltine will be delivering this lecture called The School Charter, Its Place in Our History and Meaning for Our Future. There is a Latin title, I will not embarrass myself by attempting it. We'll sort of go about halfway through, about half an hour, then we'll break for some questions, just in case anybody wants to avail themselves of the facilities, and then we'll recommence. But thank you very much, and I'll give you Dr. Julian.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a great honour to be asked back here. It's a great pleasure to be back in Boston. My parents have recently left the town to be near the family, so it's only recently that I no longer have a direct family connection to the town. I was 8 years old when we came here, so I'm not a yellow belly. But Boston is what I think of when I think of home. And this school has been so important to everything that I've been able to do. Very glad to see one people who taught me Latin here today. So it's a great pleasure to be back. When Dan invited me to talk about the charter and the foundation of the school, I was delighted. You know, of course, I said that it isn't a charter, and it wasn't the beginning of the school. Excellent, he replied. Come and tell us more. I shall begin then, not at the beginning. The establishment of grammar school in this building, 1567, or as the date stone is on the other side of what used to be the main entrance. So I don't remember that door ever being open when I was here. As the date stone has it, in the 9th year of the reign of Queen Elizabeth and during the mayoralty of William Gannick. Establishment of this building came not far short of the midpoint of a long history of education in Boston. It was an act as much of continuity, indeed of survival, and of the weathering of threatening political storms, as it was one of foundation. The charter itself, which we're here today to commemorate, technically the letters patent, and I'll return to this distinction later, and to which the school owes its present location, was issued over a decade before the opening of this building, and likewise came little before the midpoint of a much longer process, a protracted series of financial, religious and political crises which engulfed the town over more than 3 decades, and spanning the reign of every Tudor monarch except the first. Now, there are already a number of fine and detailed accounts of the origins and history of Boston Grammar School. What I want to try to do today is to reflect upon the broader national and international context and the importance of that history and of the tradition of education fostered here, as I believe is appropriate for a school whose alumni now span the globe and have achieved so much in many fields. When we look at the charter, of the circumstances which led up to the foundation of this building and its legacy, two themes for me emerge: continuity and survival in times of crisis. And these are both important for our understanding not only of the place of the Charter and of this building in the history of our school, but also for our understanding of the tradition of education in Boston, of which we are all heirs, in some cases present beneficiaries. The story it tells of survival is always relevant. There have been many occasions, both before and since the particular crisis in the 16th century to which we owe this building, when the existence of a grammar school in Boston has been threatened. When I first came here, the closure of all grammar schools and the move to the comprehensive system was progressing rapidly. There have been a number of times in the past when the school has dwindled to having no pupils, sort of falling roles problem that sent shivers down the spine of modern masters. The Charter should not allow us to rest easy in the false security of longevity, but remind us that maintaining quality education is a constant endeavour. But it's also a story of continuity. The school on this site was founded to preserve and continue an already long tradition of education, a tradition which was cultivated and fought for the benefits which it brought to the pupils and to the town. We must never fool ourselves that employability, training for careers, transferable skills, wider economic benefit, nor the cultivation of educated values, good citizenship, or the development of individual potential are inventions of our own era. They are merely new terms for values long pursued. Today's talk, then, will be divided into three money sections. Looking firstly at the history of the Charter, how this building came into being. Then I'll look at the nature of the education offered here. And finally, at the meaning of this for us today and for the future. And these three sections I've entitled Priores, Tirones, and Futuri, terms which I'm sure are familiar to everyone here. For those who are not, they come, of course, from the opening lines of the verses of the school song, or the school hymn, as its author, Dr. Pattenden, the headmaster who himself saved the school from near fatal decline in the 19th century, called it. Those who came before us, those who study here, and those who will come after us. Eagle-eyed, you will notice two further verses, which I shall return to later. All of the histories of Boston, of course, note the existence of some form of school long before the foundation of the present grammar school. These accounts, however, treading correctly within the limits of our documentary evidence for such an institution, cannot convey what we can with some certainty believe was the vitality and importance of schooling at what was, let us remember, the pinnacle of the town's fortunes as a national and international emporium. During Boston's meteoric rise from the 12th century to its glory days as one of England's, and indeed Europe's, greatest trading centres in the 14th. It's generally agreed that when the first beacon of evidentiary light shines on Robert of Muston, master of the school of St. Botolph from 1329 until at least 1335, it is the master of an already established school on whom it shines. We do not know, indeed, whether Robert of Muston was a master of any particular distinction, for the evidence survives only by chance. At this time, appointments to schools in the Diocese of Lincoln were in the gift either of the Chancellor of Lincoln Cathedral, as in the case of St. Botolph's, or of one of the prebendaries, members of the cathedral chapter. In 1329, the Chancellorship of Lincoln was vacant, and it fell to the chapter as a body to confer the post in Boston and in 5 other towns. The matter was thus recorded in the Chapter Acts. The chapter only appointed annually, that is to say on a temporary basis, until the Chancellorship was again filled, and appointments could presumably be made again for the normal longer terms of office. Although, with the chapter, which kept records, no longer responsible for the appointment, silence once again falls on the evidence. I think we can assume that Robert Muston wasn't too bad, as he did get reappointed. But as so often, either anomaly or crisis is the reason for the survival of the evidence. Robert Muston, of course, appears in all the histories. But this fragmentary evidence is only a small part of a much bigger picture. There were at least 11, possibly as many as 14 grammar schools active in Lincolnshire, in addition to the better attested Lincoln Grammar School, originally the cathedral school. These were church, I'm talking about the 14th century with the evidence possibly going back earlier. These were church schools under the patronage of the cathedral. And they would have existed in addition to the monastic schools, which provided education for their own novices and for outsiders. Now, while most of these grammar schools, like ours, and their successor institutions, now claim 16th century origins, A.F. Leach, the great pioneer of the history of education in late 19th and early 20th century, contributed to the Victoria County history of Lincolnshire. Leach believed that these 16th century foundations were rather, I quote, restorations or augmentations of schools long previously existing. Leach thought he could date schooling in Boston back to 1260, but believed that its origins were, quote, very likely much older. Now, Leach was writing in the early 20th century, and many of his conclusions, particularly about institutional continuity, as well as about the nature and quality of medieval education, have been challenged or superseded by later scholarship. So we need to be cautious, very cautious. Leach has been accused of taking any fleeting reference to a local priest teaching hymns to choir boys as evidence of a fully established school. But his optimistic estimate of the early thriving of schooling in Lincolnshire is supported by a wealth of recent research into the social, governmental and educational developments of the 12th and 13th centuries, the period of Boston's astonishing ascent to greatness. For over 30 years now, historians have regarded this as the great formative period for the origins of modern European civilization, with countless publications bearing titles such as The Making of Europe, Birth of Europe, The Origins of Europe, all about the 12th, 13th, 11th, 12th, 13th centuries, building up to what we might now call the Making of Europe thesis. Between the end of the 11th century, when the clashes between popes and emperors, known as the Investitures Contest, shattered the theocratic consensus of early medieval Europe and set in train the eventual separation of state and church, making possible ultimately the Reformation and the Enlightenment, through to the formal establishment of the first universities early in the 13th century, European civilization was transformed. It was at this time that the rule of itinerant warrior kings gave way to the birth of systematic government based on written law, literate administration, and rational systems. And the commercial revolution, as historians now call it, brought trade and towns back to life. Now, this is now widely recognised as a transformative period for Western culture, comparably important to the American, French, and industrial revolutions of a later age, which gave birth to the modern economy and to democratic politics. And the importance is that Boston was a child of this new Europe. There were settlements here, but unlike Lincoln and other places which had distinct Roman origins, Boston really became a town in the 12th century and flourished as an international centre until the 14th, in exactly this period, this Making of Europe period that historians have identified. So while we can never know exactly how much older the origins of grammar school education in Boston are, in an institutional sense, nor make claims for the continuity of particular institutions, we can set parameters which are based solidly in advances in understanding of this period. Robert of Muston was teaching in a great international trading centre at the height of the rise of literacy, government and the growth of education in England as in the rest of Europe. And Leach has, after many years of intermittent interest, found a successor, an academic who's studied the history of early education in Nicholas Orr, the University of Exeter, whose impeccably rigorous scholarship, culminating in his 2006 publication, Medieval Schools, it actually covers from the Roman period to the Reformation, has at once corrected Leach's excesses, but also confirmed Leach's positive view of the vitality of education at this time. We can set early grammar school education in Boston, they're not as a sort of fragmentary evidence and a couple of names, but as part of a thriving, vibrant culture in which the growth of education was important, and Boston was more important, arguably, in the 12th, 13th and 14th centuries than since. So these early schools, and there were more often than the exact evidence allows us to pinpoint, originally these were effectively church schools, patronised by and controlled by and serving the administrative and liturgical needs of the church. By the 16th century, as we approached the time of the Charter, things were changing, and many schools, particularly in the towns, were coming increasingly under the patronage and the control of the boroughs and guilds of the merchant elites. The shift from ecclesiastical control of schools to lay control was a major theme of Joan Simon's magisterial work, Education and Society in Tudor England. The works I'm referring to, I've noted down if anyone just want to follow them up on the little sheets that you can see. Joan Simon's work is still, after all these years, fundamental and still the most comprehensive overview of the history of education in England in the Reformation. And as she portrays, an education system designed to provide for the practical needs of the church was being displaced by the growth of schooling to meet the needs of those who now dominated the towns and whose sons would take up what she calls the lay vocations of trade and of local government. Now, I'll come back to this later when we're talking about what was actually taught in the school. But for now, it's important to note that, important as this shift was, we shouldn't exaggerate some sort of clash between church and lay education. While ever more people wanted access to education, and these lay vocations, the training of the sons of the merchant elites, were growing, there was no alternative curriculum, nor any strict separation between church or lay education. Schoolmasters were always in holy orders. Indeed, the requirement for the headmaster of Boston Grammar School to be in holy orders lasted until the 19th century. Although in earlier ages this would have been seen as a natural assumption rather than any sort of requirement or imposition. Early teachers were most often chantry priests or chaplains supported by boroughs or by guilds, who performed devotional as well as educational functions. So chantry priests and chaplains were both types of clergymen attached to private religious foundations rather than parish churches. And these accounted for a large majority of the clergy before the Reformation. Clare Cross has estimated for Boston that there were probably 70 clergy acting in the town as chaplains and chantry priests, whereas after the Reformation it's down to 4, 2 of them school teachers and 1 the parish priest. So a huge number of priests not associated directly with parochial duties. A chantry could be either a chapel or it could be an altar in the church. Chantries were often built onto the sides of larger buildings. And the chantry priest's function was primarily to say masses for the souls of the departed, for the founders of the chantry and the patrons. A chapel could provide religious services for a private household, a wealthy household, or for another institution, including guilds. And in both cases, teaching could be included in the duties of, or could be taken traditionally by the priest or chaplain. So these institutions, private chaplains, chantry priests, schoolmasters and education, are all one thing. This is where the educated, the staffing of the schools came from. Lay patrons also commonly endowed monasteries and cathedrals to provide education, either as voluntary schools, where the community boarded pupils, or outside schools. There were, in fact, a multiplicity of different arrangements to endow schooling, rather than in any sense a system. In effect, then, the clergy, or members of the religious orders, monks and monks, still effectively provided the teaching, but town boroughs or guilds came to be increasingly connected with and to support or subsidise and ultimately to control schools. So this is not a shift from a church system to a lay system. They're not two separate systems. There were various ways in which members of the clergy were paid for or to provide schooling. But funding, patronage and control did gradually shift towards guilds and to boroughs, an indicator of shifting economic and power balances. And this shift is reflected in Boston. Originally, the schoolmasters seem to have been guild members rather than its appointees, indicating that in the 14th century the school was not guild maintained, they were members rather than employees. By 1506, a papal bull refers to the grammar school of the Guild of St Mary, and later in the 16th century the schoolmaster appears as the highest paid of the 10 chaplains of this guild, which also supported 10 clerks, most likely clergy and minor orders. The term clerk also indicates having some education. One of whom ran a song school, an elementary school teaching young boys hymns and liturgical chant, alongside the grammar school. In Boston then, the grammar school, on the eve of the Reformation, was a guild school. What then were guilds, and how did they come to be so important for education? Throughout its heyday, Boston was not a free borough, but came under the jurisdiction of 3 separate manors, each tracing its origins back to grants of land made soon after the Northern Conquest. And the principal one was the Honour of Richmond, a very large estate, which included a great deal of land. Boston was only one small part of the honour. The others were the smaller fees of Tattershall and de Crillon. In effect, this meant that the town had no formal powers of self-government, but was, except for a few years under King John, administered by appointed officials of the lords of these manors. Now, this also means that there was no borough archive, which means that less evidence has survived for the history of Boston than for many other comparable and indeed lesser towns. But for the Bostonians of the day, this lack of formal power of self-government was clearly no bar to meteoric growth and sustained prosperity. Indeed, as we shall see, incorporation as a free borough, which is part of the story of the Charter, came at a time of economic contraction and in response to threat, not as the prize of success. And this is where the guilds come in. Now, guilds are often spoken of as being either religious foundations or trade or craft guilds. This is really a false distinction. A guild was a collective body for a group with shared interests through which they could regulate their own affairs and relations internally and exert influence as a body, promoting and defending their interests externally. They're an example of a form of economic association very common from the Middle Ages onwards. Most commonly, they controlled and represented the interests of particular trades or occupations, controlling standards of produce, controlling entry, negotiating prices, or fixing prices, depending on your viewpoint, negotiating taxes with the authorities. In many places, in some ways, they're sort of the merchant equivalent or precursors of trade unions. They controlled, they controlled the prices, they defended the interests, they made sure that occupations were closed off, and competition in many ways might be a slightly anachronistic way to look at it. In many places, these functions overlapped with or were superseded by boroughs or corporations, which brought together the leading men of towns as oligarchies. In France, for example, what were known as urban communes, groups of leaders. Now, in the Middle Ages, the word commune has none of the egalitarian or democratic connotations of the modern word. It meant an oligarchic collective. Urban communes often took control of local government. In Italy, similar merchant communes took control of entire cities and effectively became autonomous political institutions, the early Italian city-states of northern Italy. However, all of these bodies, from the smallest sort of craft guild right through to the one that controlled an entire city and its region, and all the more common ones in between, all of these bodies included religious services, particularly the funding of masses by priests or chaplains and the maintenance of chapels, as an integral part of their purpose, of one of the services which they provided to their members. There's a sort of bit of an overlap where there was a borough corporation, the people who ran the borough were often also the leading members of the guild, so there was no strict formal separation. The guild was a private body, but it was a private body which by virtue of its membership and its wealth, could defend the interests of its trade and negotiate effectively with government and with laws. But all, as I say, all of these bodies included religious services, the funding of masses by priest or chaplain, the maintenance of chapel, as an integral part of their purpose. They were institutions which included meeting rooms, feasting rooms, had funds, had trusts, owned land, and had chapels and maintained priests. To have asked a guildsman whether his institution was religious or economic in nature would have been to ask a virtually meaningless question. A guild did everything. And the importance for Boston is this: without a borough, the leading burghers of Boston, far from being powerless, exercised their influence, their economic interests, and their religious needs through the guilds. And this included the means by which they could influence, fund, and control the education of their children. So the guilds became the principal means by which all of these interests were of the leading members of the town. It was therefore when the shift that's been detected nationally from as boroughs took more control of education in Boston, this took the form of the guild, the merchant guilds, the Guild of St Mary particularly, funding the church and controlling it, and having the guild's chaplains being schoolmasters. 14 guilds are known from medieval Boston, but 5 of these were dominant, and it was these 5 whose lands eventually came under the incorporated borough. The Guild of St Mary, the Guild of Corpus Christi, the Guild of St Peter and St Paul, the Guild of Trinity, and the Guild of St George. As the English Reformation developed then, it was not the dissolution of the monasteries, culminating in the late 1530s, which was the major threat to the leading families of Boston. The dissolution was enormously damaging to the town's economy. Its great and wealthy priories lost. And the Lincolnshire Rising, which erupted shortly before the larger Pilgrimage of Grace in Yorkshire, affected the region. But it was the threat which emerged in the 1540s to the lesser religious institutions, the guilds and chantries, which propelled the town and its school into crisis. There were 2 so-called chantry or chantries acts, one in 1545 under Henry VIII, and one in 1547 under Edward VI. Although these are referred to as chantries acts, they were not aimed just at chantries, foundations for prayers for the souls of the departed, but at a wide range of private and non-parochial religious foundations, including colleges, private chapels, and guilds, which were religious institutions in the sense that I've described. Initially, in response to the first of these acts, under Henry VIII, Boston's leading townsmen turned to a strategy which was widely adopted across the country, taking over the guild lands and revenues themselves before these could be taken by the crown and sold off or re-granted. The dissolution of the monasteries had strong financial imperative. But for Boston, which had no separate borough corporation to assume control, this meant first incorporating as a free borough. Boston's case was aided by the Crown's awareness of the need for sea defences to be financed, which it was argued would be done more effectively by a single borough than by the laws of 3 separate manors. It was also aided by the death of Henry, Duke of Richmond, and the subsequent reversion of the honour of Richmond, which included most and most important land in Boston, reversion to the Crown. In the event, incorporation came relatively swiftly in May 1545. The guild lands and possessions could now be granted to the new corporation, which undertook to maintain the observances, the services, the charitable gifts, and the other ordinances of the donors, including maintaining a school and maintaining almshouses. So everything could carry on under the corporation, making it safe from sequestration of the Chantry Act. Separately, shortly later, the borough bought from the king the manor of Boston, the docks and customs, the Hussey land, which had been lost due to the role of the Husseys in the Lincolnshire Rising, the church rectory, the vicarage, and a good deal of other property, including some of the land of the dissolved priories. And this purchase was to be paid in instalments, paid for out of the revenues of the guild lands. Incorporation, as I hinted earlier, was a survival strategy. Now, to return to A.F. Leach again, A.F. Leach said that this was also a device to fund what he called a great speculation in property. The guildsmen became members of the corporation, they gave their own guild lands to their own corporation, they then used the revenue of that to buy up the lands of the dissolved monasteries, and the income from the guilds would service the debt for the purchased lands. But Leach lived in calmer times, and his cynicism is unfair. Boston was negotiating one of the greatest upheavals in property ownership in English history, under a newly powerful and often arbitrary royal institution. In any case, however we judge it, whether we take Leach's cynical attitude that it was a speculation, or, as I think, a necessary act of survival in desperate times under an arbitrary royal power, the aldermen and chamberlains of the 5 leading guilds granted their goods and lands to the borough and became the members of the new corporation. The last alderman of St Mary's Guild, Nicholas Robertson, became the first mayor of the new borough. St Mary's Guildhall became the new town hall. The coup was a success, but, alas, a short-lived one. While Henry VIII's Chantry's Act was concerned mainly with corruption and misgovernance, trying to look for examples of misspent money and take it into the crown, the act which followed under Edward VI was very different, driven by the Protestant ideological imperative to root out intercessory prayers for the dead as papist superstition. And now, the borough's undertaking to maintain the observances and services of the former guilds, to maintain payment for the prayers, the masses for the dead of the guild's donors, brought it under hostile scrutiny. But the effect was not immediate. It took some time for this to filter through. Nevertheless, the former Corpus Christi lands were re-granted in 1551, and those of the other 4 guilds involved, within months of this, were granted to the Marquis of Northampton, William Parr. Another severe blow. Northampton did release back to the corporation the goods and chattels of the guild, which they sold. These were desperate times. But these were severe blows, and the Guildhall itself was temporarily lost in the chaos. But fortune's wheel was rapidly turning, and in 1553, Northampton was convicted of high treason for his part in the attempt to place Lady Jane Grey on the throne, and his property was forfeit to the crown. Now, Mary has succeeded. The corporation moved to recover what it could, and in 1555, after further outlay and expenses, finally got what we know as the Charter. What the Charter, and there it is, what the Charter in fact gave them was only about a quarter of the lands originally lost, and only that of 3 of the former guilds, St Mary's, St James, St Paul, and Trinity. And even that was given in strict trust on conditions for use. So, let's turn to look at the chapter itself. I've highlighted with the yellow arrow the phrase which also is the title of this lecture. You get right down to here before you get to the point at which they're talking about the establishment of the grammar school. So as I mentioned at the beginning, what we refer to as the Charter was in fact a grant of letters patent. Letters patent means literally open letters. These are legal instruments issued under the Great Seal, which can grant officers, rights, titles to land, status, and many other benefits to individuals or to corporate bodies. And they are formally addressed to all those to whom these presents shall come. They are witnessed by the monarch, and they are enrolled, that is to say, copies are kept in the patent rolls. They're different from royal charters. Royal charters are addressed to the beneficiary. The address is then often followed with a variation on the scienter clause, let all to whom these presents come know the following. So there's the same clause there. The difference is that the letters patent are openly addressed in that way, whereas a charter is addressed to the recipient. A charter is concluded with a list of witnesses whose witness gives it force and validity rather than just the monarch. And originally, charters were held by the recipient alone. Charters were generally more formal and prestigious, but over the centuries, the two forms, which really enacted the same range of grants and benefits, converged. Copies of royal charters themselves began to be enrolled at the end of the 12th century, that is, central copies were kept, and from 1517, royal charters appear in the patent rolls. So effectively, charters and letters patent have become practically the same thing, in fact. So we don't really introduce the historical record too badly when we talk of our charter, and it certainly sounds better than to talk. We didn't letters patent day, wouldn't have quite the same ring as charter day, would it? What we most commonly know then as the school charter is a document of just under 3,000 words in Latin, and it begins with the formula I just mentioned. Philip and Mary, by the grace of God, King and Queen of England, France, Naples, Jerusalem and Ireland, defenders of the faith, Prince of Spain and Sicily, Archduke of Austria, Duke of Milan, Burgundy and Brabant, Earl of Habsburg, Flanders and Tyrol, the international context here, to all persons to whom these presents shall come, greeting. It records that the guild lands in Boston have formally supported 18 chaplains, 15 clerks and 12 poormen. These were specifically expected the maintained poor were also to say prayers for the souls of the benefactors. It states that the sequestration under King Edward VI was, quote, the extreme grief of all honest and Catholic inhabitants, and that the intention of the present grant is to reform these enormities and to provide for divine worship, maintenance of the poor and pious, and good education of the youth and children. A second stated aim here is to ease the cost for the borough of maintaining the bridge and port at Boston. Although it's important to note that none of the money arising from the recovery of these lands granted by the Charter were to be used directly for this purpose. It was rather an acknowledgement that it would ease the other costs, so the borough was still paying for the upkeep of the bridge and port. They couldn't use this money for it, but being able to have the revenue from these lands to support the school and the other purposes would ease their general expenses. So it was a restricted grant. The greater part of the document is a list of the lands and tenements granted and of their tenants, divided according to the guild from which the land had originally come, starting with St Mary, then listing the land that had come from St Peter and St Paul, and finally Trinity. Altogether, this list accounts for 2/3 of the document. It lists 50 messengers, tenements and dwellings, 227 acres and 5 perches of land, 2/3 of which originally belonged to the great Guild of St Mary's. Now, if anyone here hasn't read the document in its entirety, or its translation, provided in Bagley's Gloria Apostoli, here's just a small flavour of it, just so you know this document. Most of it is that we're here to commemorate. It says, we do give a grant to the said mayor and burgesses of our borough of Boston 1.5 acres of land with the appurtenances lying and being in Wormgate, in Boston, in the said county of Lincoln, and our 2 acres of land and pasture with the appurtenances lying in the close of land of One Rose Tavern, in Boston aforesaid, and 2 acres of arable land with the appurtenances lying and being in Boston Field, in Boston aforesaid, now or lately in the tenure of or occupation of John Panner, and 1 message or tenement with the appurtenances at the Horse Pit in Boston aforesaid, now or lately in the tenure or occupation of Mr. Taylor, and 1 message or tenement with the appurtenances near the churchyard, now or lately in the tenure or occupation of Bedford Turner. And so it goes on, over 200 of these descriptions. These are small pieces of land. And of course, it is legally accurate, so it's specifying the land, the appurtenances, and the former tenancies. And so it continues for every tenement and every piece of land that the corporation is getting back. Interestingly, buried in the middle of this list, among the former holdings of the Guild of St Peter and St Paul, is the item and one house, in which is kept a grammar school, with the appurtenances in Boston aforesaid. Probably a reference to the Wormgate house that it's in there. It's maybe that the Guild of St Mary might have been renting the schoolhouse from the Guild of St Peter and St Paul, but it's there in the charter. Finally, once we got past the majority of this document, setting out the lands, it states the terms on which the land is to be held and the uses to which it can be put. The lands were to be held on the same terms as the guilds had held them, and the same terms as Northampton had held them, or as any previous occupant. Now, this is a standard legal catch-all to ensure that no benefits are lost during the conveyancing process. The lands are valued at £60 per year, and the document then states the uses to which this income can be put. And this is, of course, the passage that is always quoted. For the finding, maintaining and establishing forever of a free grammar school in Boston aforesaid, and a fit master to teach, instruct and serve in the said school for the education and instruction of boys and youth in grammar, and also for finding 2 chaplains for the celebration of divine service in the parish church of Boston aforesaid, and 4 poor persons of the inhabitants of the borough aforesaid to pray there forever for our good and prosperous state while we live, and after our decease for the souls of us and our ancestors. And that was the principal reason for the document. I thought it was odd that it said finding. I wondered if this was a misprint, founding, but no, in many end up. Literally finding a grammar school. Finding what it means is finding the means wherewith a grammar school can be created. And the purpose there is to teach boys and youth in grammar, to fund the chaplains, and to provide for the poor, also bound up again with prayers for the souls of the King and Queen and their ancestors. Finally, the text stipulates that these grants and the issue of letters patent and gift without final fee, and that the revenues from the lands can be put to no other use. Interestingly, however, in this final section, it refers to the maintenance of a schoolmaster and usher of the school. And the usher was the second schoolmaster. Although the first part refers to the borough of town supporting the master, there's a master and an usher, two teachers are to be supported under the guild, along with other necessary things only, touching and concerning the said borough, school chaplains and foremen aforesaid. This last clause, with its note of generality, no doubt allows some legal leeway needed to negotiate the Elizabethan settlement, because not long after this, Protestantism was finally restored, and the great numbers of chaplains and clerks were gone. This is, as I mentioned earlier, the historian Clare Cross estimated the loss of some 70 priests in Boston, leaving only, in religious orders, the parish vicar, the mayor's chaplain, the schoolmaster, and the usher of the school, as the only 4 people in holy orders in the reign of Elizabeth. So, much reduced in its income, much in a town which had had a great amount of its wealth and employment taken away. The school had come through this crisis and was established. The prayers of the dead obviously didn't survive the Protestant succession. But the school was there with its master and its usher. In 1567, the corporation agreed to set up a new school building, and by 1570, the old schoolhouse had been sold. The corporation held these lands until the time of the great charity commissions of the early 19th century. And the A.F. Leach, who wrote the history of Boston Grammar School in the Victoria County history, came to his interest in the study of the history of education through serving on the charity commissions. This work was the basis for his pioneering studies in the history of education. The revenues also supported clergy into the early 20th century. But here, we've strayed far into another part of the story, and the modern era has crises and triumphs of its own for others to recount. I will pause here, the break, and take us through this turbulent history. And when we resume, we'll turn back to that section on the pupils, the Turones, and look at what was actually taught over all those centuries in the school. And then finally I'll say a few words about what I think is the importance of this history in the Charter for the future. So we'll take a break there, if that's all right.
We've had a few questions from America. Most of them, can you turn the mic on?
Right, no, that makes sense.
Let's move that a little closer.
Interesting stuff.
Just a question. What's this? Ladies and gentlemen, would you like to take your seats, please, when we will make a start on the second half of Julian's lecture? Let's get back, I suppose. Let's get to the back.
Ready to resume? Yes, I should say this is not so much the second half as the last third. Here's one of the nice exteriors of this building. There are a number of exterior views of the building. I'm going to move on, as I said, to talk the second part of my lecture entitled Tyrones, which can loosely be translated as pupils. This is a rare interior view of this building, which is not so many surviving interiors. We do have a provenance and a rough date for this. It's the early 1980s, done by me. On the inside of my Latin folder, during a free period in this very room on a Friday afternoon, I must have been sitting probably just not far from where I'm standing now. Just point out to the current pupils the device in the centre is a briefcase, not a laptop. It hadn't been invented. The pupil is looking at a book, not a device. But it's quite. I found this in my parents' loft recently. It's quite interesting. One of the things that I enjoy and value about this is that you can take. This is a building which could be treated as a museum, put behind tapes. And I think there's something. I know it's important to preserve the fabric of old buildings, but there's something wonderful about just being able to live and work and be in a building like this. And I quite find that the sort of plastic light fittings and the electric heater bolted into the 16th century fabric. I know it's not good for the fabric of the building, but it gives a sense it's a living building. It's not just a museum piece. Well, we'll never know for sure whether masters were teaching in Boston as far back as the 12th century. We know little of Roberton Muston beyond his name, and nothing about his pupils acquiring their education in the exhilarating heyday of Boston's greatness. But we can at least be certain as to what those pupils and their possible predecessors were learning. A grammar school existed for the purpose of teaching Latin grammar, the working language of the church, the law and government, and the only language understood across Europe, and for many, the only means of access to a career. Elementary teaching began with the alphabet, followed by reading and song. Having learnt the names and sounds of the letters, pupils were taught to read the so-called primer. This was a book of prayers and other liturgical material designed for use by the laity, containing the Paternoster, the Ave Maria, the Creed, confessions, and so forth. The next stage was learning to read the Psalter and to chant the Psalms, as well as antiphons and hymns, hence the term song. The aim here was to learn to recite the words necessary to the liturgy and to popular devotions, not to understand them. It was a basic competence in participation involving rote learning and recitation of sounds, and this was the education delivered to the young boys before proceeding to grammar. Only at the next stage was the meaning of these words taught, through the study of Latin grammar. And this began with the rules of Latin grammar, which were originally generally taught orally and memorised. The luxury of books for all pupils was far beyond the means of most schools. Most teachers themselves wouldn't have had access to rich libraries, but often relied on compendia of quotations and extracts from classical texts to illustrate grammatical rules. There are a number of rhymes surviving, mnemonic rhymes, in which you would learn the endings of the declensions and learn the paradigms through reciting lines, and this stuff was memorised until it was known by rote. The school books often refer to as a donat or a donet, which refer to the fact that they were copies of Donatus grammar or derivations of it, but there were a number of medieval abbreviations and commentaries. But what you were doing at grammar school was learning the rules of Latin grammar, reciting them And there are preserved questions and answers, not teachers asking questions, but a series of responses in which the teacher would say, what is the genitive, and the pupils will reply, what is the dative, the pupils will reply, until this stuff was thoroughly memorised. Recitation of rules, standard sets of questions and responses, the correct construction of sentences was central to this technical training, the end result of which was a functional knowledge of Latin based on a thorough knowledge of vocabulary and the parts of speech. Sometimes those early stages, reading and song, were taught separately in so-called song schools. In other cases, grammar schools taught reading, alphabet, and song, the psalms, etc., and grammar all together. We don't know much about the early arrangements in Boston, but as we've already seen, by the 16th century, a clerk of the guild seems to have been running a song school, and the master, one of the chaplains of the guild, was teaching the grammar. Whether in the same building or not, we don't really know. Grammar then, Latin grammar, was in fact the basis of an educational curriculum which went back to the Romans. It was the foundation of all education, and for many was the main or only subject of study. In the original scheme, it formed part of the so-called trivium, the three ways, which was the foundation of all learning. This involved the study of grammar, followed by the study of rhetoric, the art of communication, which in the ancient world was essential to a public career. It was the sons of aristocrats who were being educated. And then finally the study of logic, the art of rational inference and deduction based on the meanings, etymologies and relations of words, and the logical analysis of the syllogism. In the Middle Ages, logic became the basis of philosophy and of theology. And in the medieval universities, these three subjects made up what became known as the arts course, which every student began with, and which provided a complete course in the analysis and application of the Latin language. So that you go from a grammar school but then learn grammar in greater depth in the university before grammar, rhetoric and logic. In the Roman curriculum, this was followed by the quadrivium, the four ways, which were subjects involving the study of number, comprising arithmetic, geometry, music and astronomy. And this was less studied in the Middle Ages. It was covered at universities, the great universities, but it didn't have great impetus. Rather, it was the arts course, grammar and rhetoric, culminating in logic, which led on, for the privileged and wealthy few, to the higher studies in the universities of canon law or of theology, and thence to power. If you had the funding, the wealth, to sustain the 15 years necessary at university to graduate in law or theology, you could go on to become a bishop. For most people, the arts course was enough. That was all they could afford, and that is what gave them the access to a career as a clerk in government, in the burgeoning bureaucracies of the period. Logic was also the basis for the intellectual movement known as scholasticism, one of the most ambitious and comprehensive intellectual endeavours in human history, attempting to establish a fundamental schema of all knowledge based on a rational and consistent epistemology. The later humanists, Erasmus, Praise of Folly and so forth, gave scholasticism a bad name as obscurantist and futile, but this is very far from the mark. Scholastic theology was razor sharp, epistemologically rigorous and thoroughly scientific, engendering a rational approach to knowledge which would later be applied to the natural world and in some respects lay the basis for modern science. For most, however, Latin grammar was the sum of their education and the key to a career, either in the church or in the expanding bureaucracies of governments, which were a feature of that 12th century Renaissance or making of Europe period, the revolution in government that was taking place, that I mentioned earlier. Some would go on further to study administrative skills, the composition of letters, known as dictamen, or of charters and other documents, necessary training. Some went on to study common law, for example, at the Inns of Court, or might study accounting. This further education beyond the grammar school might be delivered by specialist teachers, might be delivered through apprenticeships, or it might be delivered in aristocratic households. In the Middle Ages, most education was thoroughly vocational, money-driven, driven by the needs of government, and ruthlessly pragmatic as never since. And Latin was the tool for access and promotion. Increasingly, this was a skill you had to learn. It wasn't a cultivation. The humanists were right when they said people don't imbibe the meaning of Cicero and his style and enjoy and appreciate Virgil. That's not what they were there to do. They wanted jobs and they needed the Latin to do it. Increasingly also in the 14th and 15th century, French, the language of law from the Norman Conquest, was taught, and from the 15th century, English began to be taught as a written language. By the 16th century, the new intellectual movement known as humanism was gaining ground. Humanists attacked the traditional methods of grammar teaching, which they derided as mere rote learning devoid of understanding, and they also attacked the intellectual edifice of scholasticism. For the humanists, the Latin classics should be studied for themselves and for their content, and not merely as devices from which to extrapolate grammatical rules. And for the humanists, the classics were not sort of literature in that sense, but they were the source, they were the treasury of all human knowledge and wisdom. Now, some would say in this, the humanists were rather backward looking. Everything that we need to know has been said by the classics, we should read and appreciate them. The scholastics were sort of using logic to create what for them was new knowledge. But times were changing. So the humanists saw the classics as, you don't extract your bits and learn your grammatical rules. You read your classics, you read Cicero, you read Quintilian, and this gives you access to the store of human wisdom and knowledge. And for the humanists, this study fostered the formation of good character. Now, medieval education had always included a knowledge of the formation of character, and the invention of printing made the humanist project easier. We could actually more readily available have copies of these classics and not have to rely on excerpts and compendium and memory so frequently. But the humanists placed much more emphasis on rhetoric, on the study of style and eloquent communication rather than on logic. It was a move away from the functional linguistic logic, the ICT of pre-modern education, towards rhetoric, the communication studies of pre-modern education. And this, as we'll see, reflected some important changes in the social needs which schools had to meet. It's doubtful how much of the intellectual revolution from scholasticism to humanism affected local school teaching. Latin grammar was still the basis for any learning. You can't read the classics until you've learned the grammar, increasingly supplemented by English. But for Joan Simon, who I mentioned earlier, the historian of education in Reformation England, the humanist stress on the formation of character rather than the mere acquisition of technical knowledge had a particular attraction for the new burgher and merchant elites who had been growing in numbers and influence over the centuries in just such commercial centres as Boston. What these people wanted was not the training in functional Latin developed to serve the liturgical and administrative needs of the church and of the new government bureaucracy, but rather the cultured outlook, the diplomatic skills and the manners that mattered to those who were now involved in business and in local government. The very skills for public life, albeit on a local stage, which the original ancient study of rhetoric had aimed to instill in Roman aristocrats. This was, for them, these were no longer the technicians of the church, but the self-regulating tradesmen and rulers of local society. The early grammar schools had taught a practical skill and taught it to the service class of the day. And while knowledge of Latin could offer access to improving literature, the job of character formation and the inculcation of what we would recognise as broader educational values was the job of the court, the great aristocratic household, or the religious community. Now, for the new merchant elite, these people were not aristocrats. They didn't have access to the royal or great courts, great aristocratic households, nor were they living in monasteries. Rather, they were active in local government and regulating their own affairs. And for this group, the school came to be the place where these two things, training but also broader education, met, where their society preserved and developed its common ethos and its common values. So, the grammar school did the training on the side, and your broader education came as your role as a member of a monastic community or an aristocratic household. The merchant elite school was doing both jobs. And this is why they patronised the schools and increasingly came to control and appoint masters. And it was this need for education to educate those who are now going to be regulating their own affairs as tradesmen, needing diplomatic skills and needing skills in local government. This explains why the hard-headed borough men of Boston throughout this crisis fought so hard for their school of Latin grammar. But what does their achievement mean to us? Well, after I've talked about the priores, those who've gone before us, talked about the tirones, or at least those of the period, those who were learning Latin at the time. So I'm going to say a final few words about the futuri, those to come in the future. Before I do, it's worth remembering, as I said at the beginning, that Pattendon's school song, or school hymn, had two further verses. One of them devoted to the magistri, the teachers, and the other to the parentes, the parents, perhaps the two most important groups in the continuing life of a school, while we pupils sort of come and go and flick through. If, as Dan suggested, this talk is going to be followed by others, and there's going to be a series, might I suggest that you invite another speaker to devote a talk to the contribution of teachers and parents to the school. As far as I'm concerned, it's time to get back to the future. Latin is, of course, no longer the foundation of the curriculum. Okay, and with reason. I am perhaps somewhat exceptional in that I use medieval Latin on a daily basis in my job. Okay. Learning Latin here has, as for those students in the past, has given me access to a wonderful and fulfilling career. But of course, I am in the minority perhaps. The medium of education was changing. Boston's corporation paid for a Greek dictionary in 1601, a reflection perhaps of humanist culture or a Protestant interest in the original languages of the New Testament. English came to be taught, reflecting the changing needs of business and government. Those leaders of local society needed to be able to communicate and write in English. Later centuries brought modern languages, sciences, economics and literature. And the idea of a school curriculum moved away from the idea of a single course of learning, which started with grammar and moved on to the model of the separate subjects, which of course we know for us education is pick your subjects. It's an array of separate subjects. Pre-modern education was a single course. You followed it as far as you could. And in the separate subjects model, Latin is taught neither as a vocational skill nor as the key to all knowledge, but as a cultural and historical subject, one of many such subjects. But the questions raised of the relative merits of utility and personal development still apply to today's curriculum, as they did to the medieval curriculum and the Reformation. We value these subjects not just, or not even primarily for their content, but for the orientation in the world and for the mental acuity that they foster. And these two values, proficiency in life skills on the one hand and the ethical or social values instilled in higher education on the other, are still in balance. Governments like to measure the former, but the latter, the broader values of education, while not quantifiable, are, I think, demonstrably more important to economic growth and to the flourishing of society. And to understand why, we need to take a brief parting look at a new intellectual revolution, which is transforming the way we understand the world. You'll probably be aware that there's a lot of talk now of concepts like trust, social capital, and social networks. The understanding that it's not the formal structures and hierarchies of institutions, businesses or states that explain their workings, the workings of the world, but the informal networks of friends, colleagues and acquaintances, the networks of trust, which determine how, when and why we will do or not do things, the extent to which we will act and help people, take risks or do nothing, the extent to which we will cooperate and create, or go to war and destroy. The research on this goes back to the 1960s, and career services now routinely use networking as a teachable technique. But behind this lies a quieter revolution in the understanding of what makes these networks, these social networks, so effective and so valuable in explaining political and historical change. And this is an area in which medieval historians have been particularly active. It's generally termed the history of emotions, but this is not, as it might sound like, the history of how the expression of feelings or behaviours have changed over time, but is rather based on the insight that the most important political, financial and commercial decisions and actions are based on emotional engagements, not abstract rational calculations. Since the 2008 crash, this has been turning the science of economics on its head. We've had the syllabus revolts in British universities where students have demanded to be taught the psychology rather than the mathematics of economics. When analysts began to reveal that the UK's vote on EU membership had been decided essentially by voters' feelings and senses of identity, by hearts, not heads, and this equally on both sides, this knocked campaigners, politicians and pundits sideways, but came as no surprise to historians who have been tracing the links between identity, feelings and political outcomes for some time. Using emerging techniques like historical network analysis, we are learning to map emotions rigorously and scientifically as significant causal factors in history. They are, after all, what make the decisions. People get heated about the referendum, not because we're talking about changing regulatory frameworks, because it affects the way everybody on both sides feels about who they are and what they belong to. Education is an important part of this. It provides a perspective on the nature of human knowledge and achievement, which enriches our worldviews, fosters appreciation of the value of the preservation and transmission of knowledge, and builds the shared cultural values that expand our area of common experience through a sense of community and belonging, which is shared with the past. This in turn expands the bases of trust, what we're willing and what we want to do, and makes cooperation possible, driving political and economic progress. For while moments of stress like 2008 or the referendum bring matters of identity and action to light, for the most part shared values function to promote stability, and indeed to determine our reaction to crises and stresses. Now this is not easy to measure in numerical terms. Politicians still prefer the simpler but less perhaps accurate measures of economic impact and economic growth. But this is measurable by its lack. Societies where discussion is restricted, where humane education is controlled by the state, where propaganda replaces history and where fear determines survival, and societies where intolerance and divisiveness determine policies, are also economically stagnant and fragile societies. Latin, like all of the subjects we study, remains, without needing to be universally taken up, part of the armoury of a free society and of our sense of our heritage, and one of the now many subjects through which we can think about ourselves and our place in our past and in our community. Finally then, what does all this have to do with why I'm here today, with this building and the history I talked about in the first part of the talk? What can we here possibly have in common with the pupils of Robert and Muston, drinking in exciting new learning in the midst of the bustling, multilingual metropolis of Boston in the days of its international greatness? What can we possibly have in common with the generation of William Gannock, dusting themselves down after a series of crises and blows, gathering in the remains of their prosperity and resolutely planning a new future? What do we have in common with those many generations who learnt in this very room as Boston's fortunes shifted from commerce to agriculture? What do we have in common with those of our school fellows who, inspired by the confidence of an age of new science and a vision of seemingly limitless human progress, left this building full of idealism for the slaughter of the trenches and saw the opening of a new dark age? Even my own school days at the tail end of the Cold War seem now almost like another era, with its own sounds and sights, with no computers, no devices, no digital media. And what do all of these experiences from the 14th century down to the 1980s mean to today's pupils? And what will they mean to their children and their grandchildren who may sit learning in this building? Well, the answer, I think, is this. We do not engage with abstract values, but with the people and places we trust and identify with. It's these connections, this sense of experiences which connect over time and which are focused in institutions, which form the link, the real, historically causal link, between our abstract ideals and our actions. The historian Barbara Rosenwein coined the term emotional community to describe the commitments and engagements focusing on a body or an institution and which explain why it survives, how it affects its members' decisions, and how it contributes to social stability and prosperity. And this involves not the false pride of claiming that you are better than all the others, but the meaningful appreciation of common values. Schools like this, events like this, communities like this, are in that sense emotional communities. And so long as we keep them alive, they are part of the texture which contributes to our individual senses of well-being, to the flourishing of the town and the region, and to the stability of society. The past is never quaint, it's never a golden age, but it can always be a source of inspiration. And flourishing, as I mentioned, the flourishing of society, flourishing was the idea central to Dr. Pattendon's vision of the school, as articulated in the refrain of the school song, now the motto, familiar to us all, Floreat Bostona. And this is perhaps the most apt note on which to end this talk in this building. May the school flourish, may we all flourish. Floreat, Florearchs.
Say a big thank you on everyone's behalf to Julian. I think that was an absolutely wonderful lecture, informative and insightful. So a big thank you. Can we have another round of applause, please? We have got a token, a small token to show our appreciation. It was very well hidden away. Thank you, Julian.
Thank you very much.
I know that Julian is willing to take some questions, but I'm also aware that some of our boys do need to catch, and some of the girls as well, in fact, do need to catch buses, and there are only a few more minutes left. Before I do hand back over to Julian, though, can I just say a massive thank you as well to Dan Elkington, without whom this lecture would not have been able to take place today. Dan is the president of the Old Bostonians, and obviously it's through him that all the liaison has taken place to get this organised. And I think it's a great tradition that we're about to start, I hope. Yes, so again, round of applause please for Dan and Indy. It's also great to see some of the lads wearing the new tie as well, the 450th anniversary tie. Splendid thing. I advertise that because I know that they're still trying to sell them. I'm not on commission, unfortunately, but you know that might be arranged later, depending on how sales go. If there are some students who do need to catch buses, on a serious note, I think it's probably wise if you go at this point in time. If you don't need to catch a bus, obviously you're more than welcome to stay. The more the merrier. And I know that Julian is keen to take any questions. But if we can just allow the students to go if they need to. Thank you for attending, folks. Have a good weekend. I understand that there are also some questions potentially from our colleagues over in America, the Latin School.
Pretty continuing with stuff as they go on.
Oh, are you? Okay.
The questions they've asked are how big is the school? Is Latin still taught? Apparently, Boston Latin School of America actually is compulsory for 4 years.
Right.
And they don't only do Latin, they also do further Latin and Latin poetry as separate subjects.
Wonderful. We're very fortunate indeed. I'm afraid not, is the answer. We don't do any Latin, unfortunately. Okay, over to you, Julian. I don't know if there are any of our guests who have any questions for you.
I was just going to ask you about, I mean, you sort of semi-answered this. Clearly in medieval times, Latin grammar was the basis of everything. When did Greek start to come along as a subject being taught generally in the school?
At school level, not really before the 17th century. I mean, it was rare. Knowledge of Greek was rare anyway before humanism. It didn't figure in medieval universities. There are one or two scholars. What actually interesting was going on was that Aristotle particularly, so about the 13th century, the medieval theological curriculum was revolutionised by bringing in, they'd formally based it mostly on the works of Plato, but not, in fact, on Boethius's Latin commentaries on Plato and translations. Aristotle came to the West because it had been preserved in Eastern libraries and then translated into Arabic. And what Western scholars were doing were going to places like Spain and Sicily, learning Arabic and translating the Arabic translations of Aristotle into Latin. So ironically, it was the Greek was even less known. What the Reformation theology really, apart from the appreciation of the original language of the classics, was of course focused on the understanding of the Bible in the original language. Medieval scholars had learned Hebrew from, a few had learned Hebrew from the Jewish communities in Europe in order to correct the texts that they'd have of the Old Testament. So yeah, ironically, Hebrew and Arabic were better known than Greek really until the Reformation. And I think it was this idea that you got rid. But one of the things that went with scholasticism was also the approach to the study of the Bible through the accumulated wisdom and commentaries. So a medieval Bible for study would typically have the words of the Bible in very large lettering spaced out, and then be completely surrounded by commentaries, which would be quotations from Jerome and Augustine and Bede. So part of the Reformation was to sweep this away and just go straight to the Word. Of course, when you go to Jerome's 4th century translation for the New Testament, what you really need to do is learn Greek. So again, it was driven by what was considered necessary to understand the theology. And when the scholastic approach tended to see the mystery, the Jerome's Vulgate was taken as the definitive version of the Word of God. The concept of mystery was that truths were embedded in the words and could be teased out by linguistic logic. They believed essentially that there was a direct relationship between the sound of a word and its meaning. So you don't need to learn Greek and Hebrew. You just need this rigorous analytical study of Latin grammar, and that will tease out the mysteries that are embedded in the Word of God. So really it was this change in the approach to how you understand the Bible which brought the necessity, the perceived necessity to learn Greek. And again, if you're the son of a merchant in Boston, it's not going to do you any good. You need to have you need the ability to know the Latin grammar. Partly it was just that you'd be considered an ignoramus if you didn't. If you were anybody, you'd have learnt your grammatical rules, you could understand the words of the church services, you could probably read a charter, and you also then needed to learn a bit of English for later. It was partly it was technical necessity, but also it was partly that you didn't want to move in this society by being considered uneducated and being educated. Literates meant Latin. When people are described as illiterate, it means they can't read Latin. So it's partly a social accomplishment, a badge of inclusion in the educated elite, who were a very small number, and partly a practical thing. And it's self-reinforcing that while you're educated groups, education is based on Latin, and things will continue to be expressed or written in Latin, and it continues itself. So it's part of the common culture of the educated. Which is why I think it's important to sort of distinguish. They weren't studying the classics, they weren't learning what we learned, they weren't looking at Virgil in its historical context. So Latin as a modern subject is very different. I'd say more interesting because it's historical and empathetic. But anyway, yeah, so.
Yeah, I learned Latin under Joe Gledhill 60 years ago by rather primitive means. But it has helped me. For instance, I've lived in France for quite a bit and it helped with that. But your comment about the Facebook society, it seems to me that everything's the same. So that, for instance, the New Scientist is of equal value to the Daily Mail. And I wonder how you look at no leadership element of modern education and society.
Well, the idea of sort of discriminating between the quality of what's coming. I mean, this is actually one of the new uses, really. I mean, there's always been propaganda. You know, the fake news was invented when writing was invented. But yeah, the need to assimilate and discriminate the information that comes out. I think that's something that schools and universities have always done. Yeah, there's more of it, I suppose. There are, it's by the same token. Now, any student can, at the click with open access, can at the click of a button get completely free access to the full text of Oxford University Press monographs. So, there's good and bad, and so in some ways. Is it more important, or is it as important as it always was? That what you hope an education will do is give people a discriminating outlook on the world, because the alternative is to suppress and ban all this rubbish. But then you're in not in a free society. So it's maintaining that balance. And there's times when you think, oh, I just love to click my fingers and have such and such newspaper wiped off, but you lose then. Better to be discriminating than censoring, I suppose. Yeah.
I guess following on from your answer to Bill's question, and this might not end up as a question, but we heard from John, the headmaster, that the Latin is important at the school, and we had on the Facebook, our Facebook group the other day, the perennial suggestion, why learn or be interested in a dead language? Now, Bill and I both had a go at answering that question, but whether you have any feelings on that?
It's almost the same as saying why learn or be interested in the past. And yeah, you can, as an educated reader, you can read a lot. I've read a lot about Russian history. I don't speak a word of Russian. So I think there's a sense in which it's important. We can't maintain a full and healthy appreciation of the past without people who are capable of doing that. And there are too few of those. We have a problem now with people doing historical research, let alone into the classics themselves, who don't have the background in Latin. So as I said before, yeah, it's not. You can't any longer say that that the only way to be educated is to know Latin. But on the other hand, if you cut Latin out for everybody and don't allow a sufficient group of people, you're cutting out access to a lot of the history and culture. So and to a surprisingly late period. How you look at people looking at philosophy. Well, characters like Hegel, was a Greek philologist or classical philologist. People like Karl Marx, his education was in the classics. So there's a sort of that you read, you pick up. I don't know, look at Middlemarch. I meant to. Every third or fourth line is a reference to the King James Bible, where you could say, well, Shakespeare in English is a dead language. Let's forget it. So it's a difficult one, because you could say, well, there are certain things that you need to provide for in education does have to train people to be useful members of society as well as give them perspective. I would, I suppose I would say that it's an unfortunate perception that Latin's a dead language, because that means that anything in the past is dead. Give it another, it's people are already reading Shakespeare with explanatory footnotes. Is Shakespeare dead? So yeah, that's what I mean in the sense that it becomes one of the subjects that we need to keep going. Okay, well, no, I wouldn't say that we need to make everybody do it necessarily, but if we do too little of it, then that dies away, and there aren't people who are capable of doing it. So
it's interesting you raise that discussion. This is a very typical Facebook experience. I wrote a short comment. I started off by writing about 300 words, and I thought, no, that's only going to inflame things. So I cut it down. But one of the examples I gave, so I personally, and Ron Abbott sitting behind me will laugh at this because I'm such a mediocre Latin scholar. I personally think it was one of the most useful subjects I did at school because it makes you a very... If you learn a certain amount of Latin, anyone I think who studied it to any level will tell you it makes you a much more disciplined writer of your own language, I think. But one of the examples I gave in this deleted 300-word screed was of a software company I've worked with in the city that hoovers up classics graduates from Oxford and Cambridge and Bristol and makes them into computer programmers. And I remember having this discussion over coffee in HSBC about 15 years ago when I was doing some work for them. And the chap who was doing their recruitment said, well, yes, it doesn't matter if they've never programmed a computer before. We know that if they have got a 2-1 or whatever in classics, they have the discipline, they have the kind of the mental structures to be excellent computer developers.
This is...
It's not as useless as some might think.
We were actually, we all did French in the first year, and then we had to choose between Latin and German. And I was ironically very quiet at school. Somebody said, "Oh yeah, but the advantage of Latin is you don't have to speak it." That decision changed an awful lot, and there is sort of what's compelling about it as well is you can't just go to the native speaker and find out how it should be done. So it has there's that in it as well, and the fact that so much of what survives isn't the ordinary chit chat, but it's very highly crafted stuff. So in all those ways, it's a wonderful intellectual discipline. I sort of find that it. I've always been compelled by it, and I thought, I wasn't in that sense a natural linguist, and it didn't come to me as easily as this study of history, but the two together. And I wonder if I'd have been more of a natural linguist, I might have gone for classics rather than history, but possibly it's nothing. It was very, because the Cambridge Latin